Thank you. So I'm so very pleased to be here today, and thank you, Chris, for the very kind introduction. Promise made, promise kept. We recently had good news from the FDA, or Sarepta had good news, but that's good news for all of us in terms of their drug, eteplirsen, which has been studied in 12 patients in the United States, and more patients had that experience in Europe. So we're very excited to see the compelling data at 120 weeks where boys who were expected to decline were stable. So I'm actually waiting for a cue that that my presentation is up. Otherwise, I'll probably have to do some sort of a dance and get you all involved in some activity. So I'm going to talk to you about benefit risk, and I'll talk to you a little bit about why we did benefit risk and what it meant. We have a regulatory agenda, and we've been meeting with the FDA on several occasions. And during those first occasions that we met with the FDA, we really wanted to talk to them about the unmet need and to describe what life is like with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, what it's like to get up every morning and know that your son doesn't move in some way or is delayed, or as he gets more involved in his disease, he can't turn over in bed at night, he can't walk, he can't go to the bathroom by himself. Some of them can't move their arms, they need help with breakfast. So then you get this young man, an adolescent, who should be with his friends and playing ball or enjoying what they enjoy as adolescents, and you're taking complete care of him, and you take him to school and set him up, and hopefully set him up with people who can help him during the day. And maybe sometimes, in my case, I used to run back to school every day at noon so I could help my boys with the bathroom because they went to a parochial school and they didn't offer help. And then I was back there at lunch to help them with lunch, and back there again at 3 o'clock to bring them home, and then slept on their floor for about 7 years while I turned them back and forth. It's a devastating, heartbreaking disease, and so when we can talk about with the FDA what it's like so that they can understand that benefit, the degree of benefit we'll take, and at the beginning when my sons were diagnosed, the degree of benefit I was willing to accept was 5 minutes more on their lives. So I think it's different today, and we have certainly other opportunities, but when you see your son degenerating every single day, or you know that he's losing muscle cells every single day, benefit, an incremental benefit is really what you're looking for. And when we talked to the FDA about this need, they listened. We also talked to them about the equation of what risks you're willing to take is different in a disease like Duchenne muscular dystrophy than it is in another disease. So you're willing to accept some risk for the potential of benefit. And one of their responses was, yes, but we don't have any data about benefit risk. So we can get anecdotal stories, and you as a mother might be willing to accept more risk than another person who's not willing to accept such risk. So to that end, and if it comes up if it comes up, I'll be able to talk to you about a pilot study on benefit risk, because we wanted to partner with FDA, and we wanted to say to them, if there's something you need that we can get from our community, we're going to get that for you. And we're going to do a rigorous study so that the data you have is rigorous data, meets your bar of expectation, and that you can utilize it and apply it in your review process. So we have a successful experiment in a pilot form of benefit risk. And so I wanted to share a little bit about that today. But at the end of the day, if I'm going to just be talking and then have you dancing shortly for 20 minutes, it proved to us, and certainly in some cases parents went, well, of course we knew that. And we did, of course we knew that, but we didn't have data to share. And so the data suggests that parents are willing to take more risk. It further suggests that parents' priority is to achieve or find or locate the best possible care for their child, and that they want disease stabilization before anything else. Their least important priority was themselves. They didn't really care what happened to them. They didn't care about the burden placed on them. They didn't have any worries about that. Their worries were focused on their child, focused on the well-being of their child and the quality of that child's life. And so I think this proved out in our benefit risk theory is a story, and I'm happy to say that I can talk to you about that now. Maybe. Nope. Great. So we're ready to go? Okay. So this is about treatment preferences. I first always start every talk with the patient, with our children, because I think this is the reason we're here, And all of you who are developing drugs, all of you, if you are in basic science, if you're thinking about developing drugs or you have a wonderful idea, it really must begin with the patient and it must end with the patient, because this is the reason you're here. This is the reason we want drugs and need drugs, and this is the end user of the drug. And so for us as advocacy organizations, we want to work along the gamut of diagnosis, optimal care, the advance of therapies, and certainly the access to therapies. So we are your soldiers when it comes to access, when it comes to reimbursement. We're going to look at that and insist upon that for the people we care about. So I don't know if this film is going to work. Can we run these videos? All right, I don't think they will run on this machine. But okay, this is a little boy. Imagine this is your son and you saw those calf muscles. And you had a lovely, wonderful mother-in-law that said, boy, that child's going to be a football player, right? Look at those calves. And say you had a little boy that you looked at and he was, well, he was not doing anything. But he was looking like this, and I don't know if we can run that video. So imagine you saw this as a mom. Okay, we're not going to see that. And imagine your son had to talk about this, and I'm hoping this video will play. No? Can you all get that video to play?
It's pretty much a disease that makes my muscles weaker as my life goes on. I will probably die younger than my friends, but I usually don't think about that.
You can imagine as a parent, when your son knows that his life is going to be shorter than perhaps his friends, or perhaps everyone in the family, how difficult that is. Sam's a very strong little kid. He also tells us he doesn't think about it much, and when people talk about his calves, he tells them he's ripped, and he's going to be really fancy. So the study goals of benefit risk. This was our interaction with the FDA when they asked us to provide them some data rather than anecdotal stories about the risk we were willing to take and the benefit we were interested in receiving. So this is a pilot study. Holly P.A. from our organization, who's a social scientist and just generally brilliant, conducted the study in concert with John Bridges from Johns Hopkins. She did that in a record amount of time, and the reason was because we were really pressuring her, because if FDA asks us for something, we want to give that something to them in the next 5 minutes. And so Holly was under extraordinary pressure. And so the specific aims are, as you see, we wanted to describe risk tolerance and health-related quality of life. We wanted to be very specific. We wanted to explore treatment preferences and risk tolerances. We wanted to know what risks these parents were willing to take. And within the survey, we used a word like hemorrhage, not because we felt that it was a common term, but because we felt like these parents would be frightened by the term and know that that's not a really great thing to experience in terms of a hemorrhage. We wanted to see if there was a change in the effect over the child's progression, because sometimes when a child is diagnosed, maybe you're less willing to be, in your view, a guinea pig than you are as you see the full effect of the disease on this child. And we wanted to explore what they were worried about. So the methodology was developed in concert with a health economist, and his name was John Bridges. It was the best and worst scaling type 2, and for those of you who do these, there is a methodology around that. And this was really to try to use this experiment to have, to make it work and to provide that data that the FDA was looking for. So benefit risk is a theory about how people make choices and what they're willing to give and what they're willing to receive on the end of that. And so this was also based on the random utility theory. We wanted to do this right so that the FDA would recognize, first of all, the need and the answers and the credibility of the patient voice, because I think there's nothing more credible than the patient voice, and I think we're all very pleased with Videsia that encourages further listening to the patient voice. So 5 parents contributed, so we had this advisory committee. We wanted them to understand and work with us about what the worries were. The researchers obviously refined the items and grouped the items. They also talked about the words. They talked about every little bit of this survey. We wanted to use words parents were both familiar with and not familiar with, and we wanted to look at worry domains for these parents, so that health, quality of life, social support. We wanted to understand what this really meant for these parents, and the parents that worked with us really found this was a thoughtful exercise, actually. We wanted to talk about treatments. So we had this large pool of hypothetical attributes and levels identified in consultation with these parents and providers. We talked about benefit, because your first thing about parents, when you say, what would you like? What would they like? A cure, right? And that's a pretty big word to deliver, and of course it depends on at what stage of the disease you're talking about that and what you can possibly do, and the questions about can you reverse the disease. So we wanted to make sure we were talking about something that was real and possible and on their minds without going way afar and say, there's magic on the horizon. The items were reduced and plausible attributes that are sufficiently balanced to ensure that this experiment would be successful. So we went through this whole process, and Holly developed the survey instrument. It was piloted by 7 parents. They came back, and we went back and forth to make sure that this survey really did meet the needs, was understandable, was a thoughtful exercise on the part of the parents who participated. So you can see this worry list. These are the things parents told us, and their main worries, as you can see, is my child is getting weaker. Will he miss out on new treatments? Am I giving my child the right care? And then the other things that parents worry about, no matter healthy or ill, is my child happy? Will he have good friends? This is compounded by a disease like Duchenne muscular dystrophy, where weakness isolates the child from participating on a social level in many instances. So external focused, do you have time for yourself? Do you care about what you need to do? Do you have external interests? I think when we make a diagnosis of Duchenne muscular dystrophy or other profound diseases such as this, we should diagnose Duchenne, but we might also want to take care of the parents and diagnose chronic sorrow, because it is certainly present and often unrecognized. So treatment attributes: muscle function, slowing or stopping the progression of muscle disease. Do they want an expansion of lifespan? Because the current lifespan of Duchenne is in the mid to end of 20s, sometimes into the 3rd decade. But would you trade stopping the disease for a less lifespan? We talk about some of the therapies, and we talk about the fact that, is the heart built to last, in other words? And so if you give a child more walking ability, that may in fact shorten his life, and we wanted to bring that up in this discussion. We also wanted to know about post-approvals. What information do you need to know to make a decision for your child? So what is it that's important to you in this? So we continued with, what sort of side effects are you willing to accept? Nausea every day, headaches every day, or worse. Are you worried or prepared for a potential arrhythmia? Now I want you to also keep in mind that this was not flavor specific in terms of looking at any particular drug or any particular pipeline, any particular drug that was in the pipeline. So we were targeting this quite generally, as opposed to suggesting that a particular drug that was going into a clinical trial had these side effects. So we wanted to have this sort of a very objective review. So we recruited from our own registry, which is called Duchenne Connect, from PPMD, from social networking, and as you might imagine, the advocacy voice is very loud. People have phones, so we're all connected in wonderful and amazing ways. And so we were able to reach out quite quickly and recruit about 119 parents. These were parents. These are what I call first responders. So this was not the parents that are not connected. We didn't go finding in clinics people of a certain socioeconomic background. So I think that this survey needs to be expanded into other populations. So this was the first responders in my view. So 8 treatment scenarios, 16 worries, risk-taking measure, as you see, and we did this according to the methodology that was outlined earlier. So there were 18 treatment choice tasks and 16 worries, and these were computer generated and altered as parents took the survey. So I'm going to get to the results. Is this just an experiment of the example where you see what parents had to make choices, best and worst choices, where they had to look at the progression of weakness as opposed to the increased risk of heart arrhythmia and make choices in there. So this is the preliminary analysis, and I'm going to get right to what happened here, because I think it's really quite incredible. It's 119 parents. The mean age of the parent that was participating was 43.7 years old. And it wasn't, you kind of would expect, or I expected going on, that we would get parents of very young children. So I thought they'd all be 7 to 9 years old. Well, in fact, the mean age of the child was 12.1 years. There were 80% biological mothers, and we were happy to say 34 biological dads. So I thought that was terrific, and some adoptive parents. 107 married, 11 divorced, or separated, or widowed. So we're talking also about parents who probably were average in terms of socioeconomic status, and they were well-educated parents. So these, again, are the first responders, the people that are connected, glued in, participating on social networking sites, very interested, very engaged, and very well-informed. So you can see here the mean age of many of them went to college, most of them went to college, so we are looking at a pretty informed population that participated. It's interesting here that 22 of these parents had lost a child. So we're going to look at that subset of parents to see if their individual benefit and risk choices were different than parents who had not. So 110 had one affected child. Many of them, most of them had private insurance. 68% of them have participated in clinical research, whether that's a natural history study or a clinical trial going on. And as I mentioned, many of them, several of them, 22, had experienced another death of another child. So this is how they had to choose the option, which best describes their child, so that we could track where the child was in his disease progression. This is the attribute description that we used and we ranked, and you can see some of this. And you'll notice that stop progression of weakness is at the top of the list. These parents wanted their children to stabilize in disease progression. So when Chris talks about his antisense oligonucleotide for exon 51, and when we see that data coming out of there, you can imagine how compelling that is for parents to even imagine that that's a possibility when that's not something physicians routinely say to us. The lifespan, it didn't seem to really impact these parents. I mean, it's not that they don't want their child to live long, but stabilization of disease progression. They were interested in follow-up. They were interested in taking on risk. And you can see here, no increase of bleeds. You can see that the very low priorities these parents gave to that and the risk they are willing to take. So this is the statistics of we've given this in a very, I think, easy to read. Weakness is primary, lifespan less, and nausea and vomiting, bleeding, arrhythmias. So we're looking at those arrhythmias, we're looking at nausea and weakness on these parents. This is also the preliminary results of the study. So you can see my child getting weaker. I think as a parent, when you wake up every morning and know that a muscle cell is going away, and you prepare and you continue this equation that you make in your mind. If this happens, then that happens. If I get this drug, then my child will walk X years longer, will live X years longer. And it's always that equation. And it's usually there's a line drawn at loss of ambulation, because when the loss of ambulation occurs, there's certainly a loss of hope and a priority shift for parents, because they have to do so much more in terms of care of their child once ambulation is gone. Usually requires a van, so there's a financial burden. It requires different accommodation at home, wider doorways, usually beds on the first floor. It often requires somebody to be at home full time. So the child getting weaker is a priority, and that we were able to prove. So these are conclusions. They prioritize muscle function over any other attribute, including lifespan, including serious risks. So I think this is a take-home message for rare disease. Patients are willing to take on risk, and stabilization of disease progression is the most significant. Their significant worries were related to the child, not their own. They didn't care much about themselves, their care, their lives, but only focused on the child. And it suggests that the parent population is highly concerned, and they are willing to interact, willing to take risk, willing to sign on to clinical research, and certainly want, as fast as possible, access to the pipeline that is growing for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So our next steps. And so we're just trying to think about next steps and what's going to be important. The FDA has said to us it's really important to expand beyond that 119 parents to get what we consider parents who are not participating in clinical research, not on social networking, maybe because of cultural differences, maybe because of religious or philosophical differences, but the parents are unconnected or disconnected. And I think we're finding that there is this subset of social networking parents who are there 24/7, and then there is a population of parents who are just not there. And if you talk to them, it would be very interesting about, I think, an interesting study about the quality of life, because it's difficult for a parent, I think, to not be there, but it's also difficult to be there every day when you hear little bits of information and you're looking forward to the next steps. So it would be a very interesting study that we're considering. So we want to also know from the FDA, how are you going to use this knowledge and apply it in review? Because we don't really want to do a gigantic benefit risk and expensive benefit risk study if they just say thank you very much and set it aside. We feel that the patient voice, not only through the benefit risk, but through social networking, through all sorts of different social networking tactics such as petitions and other activities, has really raised the public awareness and also raised the attention of the FDA. So we think that they are applying it and being thoughtful in review. We'd like to see more flexibility, and we'd also, as you might imagine, as a patient population, like to see things expedited. So I think the other issue that we've done, along with the benefit risk of tell your story, the stories are amazing of these parents and what they'll do and what they have done, first of all, to get a diagnosis. We have seen parents who have seen 26 doctors who have said to them, my son is weak, he's not walking very well, show him the big calf, show him how he doesn't really compete with the children his own age, and gone from doctor to doctor to doctor. Hopefully that's changing, but some of the philosophy behind that is there is a therapeutic nihilism that says in rare diseases and in Duchenne that why diagnose because there's no intervention. Well, I think we're here to tell you there's a robust pipeline that we're thrilled about, and so we want this disease diagnosed very early on. We're looking at newborn screening and opportunities there to really promote newborn screening, because we think diagnosis and treatment at a very early age and at birth would be very useful. The parents telling their stories are impactful not only for, hopefully, for basic scientists, but for industry. I think we're always thrilled about having industry partners, and the ability to tell your story as a patient gives you strength. It gives you strength because someone else is listening, someone else is probably studying your disease, interested in it, probably developing a drug or hopeful of that, and willing to maybe take you to the regulatory authorities to help promote and expedite pathways. Also help you design trials. These are hard trials in rare diseases because the patient's trajectory of their illness and because of where this patient stands in his illness. And I think that comes back to us as parents to say to you in your trial design, I know you are going to test a narrow subset of patients, particularly on a primary outcome, but that means everyone who doesn't fit the inclusion criteria is lost in the back of the bus waiting for an approval. So trial designs, we are hopeful, because we're willing to accept risk, we would like them to be inclusive, and we'll work with you on patient-reported outcomes. So we're hopeful that this is both, this benefit risk has helped industry as well as the FDA recognize the need to treat patients and intervene early and often, as FDA often talks about, but to bring them into the fold about trial design, to have trial designs that are fair, to think about patients that have multiple children in a family and how you'll get all of those children, even if one or more does not meet the inclusion criteria. So the tell their story is patient empowerment. It's also helpful for the regulatory authorities, and we've used that, I think, quite well with the regulators. So outcomes, this is one last thing. Now, Patrick Denger is a little boy from Boston, and he participated in one of the clinical studies. Now, he participated in a safety study, so there's no way this is a new activity for him. But I just wanted to point this up as you develop trials and outcomes. This young man could not cross his legs, and you think, really, who cares, and what does that matter for the quality of your life? Well, if you're sitting in a wheelchair and you can't move your legs, but suddenly you can cross your legs, it means you're more comfortable. It means you've done something on your own. And Patrick had the biggest smile. As I say, and I will reiterate, this is not because of a drug. He was in a safety study. But I think this is where outcomes are very important and what's meaningful to the patient. So patient-reported outcomes are going to be important, and the more we explore this together, and we've talked to the FDA about this and talked about composite scores that are what is meaningful to the patients, and if those things are changing, is that it may not be sufficient to approve a drug, but it should be included in their review process as meaningful and important to the patients. So this is our benefit risk study. We plan to expand it. We're talking about how. We are also going to ask the young men, because we have a question from the FDA, and that question is, are the young men willing to accept the same degree of risk for the same degree of benefit or a limited benefit? And I think that's a question that's unknown. And I would guess that it really depends on the trajectory of the illness. I think under the age of 10 years old, most boys with Duchenne muscular dystrophy would look to their parents and say, should I? Because the trust lies there. But as the boys become more involved in their disease, they're less likely to participate in clinical studies because they get a routine. They are in school, or they're with their friends, or they're in their activities, and so to take them out of those activities is really difficult for them, and it changes their schedule. So I think we need to ask them, are they willing to participate in clinical trials, and B, what would it take, for what degree of benefit, what kind of hopeful promise would they like to talk about, and what are they willing to risk, because they're already at risk having limited function in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, the risk of cardiac disease, and most of the drugs in the pipeline don't cross into the heart. So I think the benefit risk equation in the young adult men with Duchenne may be a little bit different. Then again, it may be just, let's take it all, let's do something wild and crazy, and we're willing to take the risk. But this is an unknown, and the FDA has asked us to learn about it. So this is one of our intended next steps. So these are the collaborators, just so you know. I think as an advocacy organization, we always reach out to experts. We want to do things right in order to be useful partners to the FDA because we think it's important. We want to have the FDA be partners with us. And more recently, we've embarked as an organization on draft guidance. Now, so this was an interesting meeting with the FDA in which we talked about the EMA and tried to think about how could we not harmonize efforts, even though that's a goal, but how can we have the same information to the EMA and to the FDA, and how can you somehow agree on things that are problems within our community? And so Dr. Woodcock in the neurology division suggested to us that we might write draft guidance. So we are now embarking on draft guidance. We have a steering committee of 7 members. We have 7 working groups looking at diagnosis, benefit, risk. We have natural history biomarkers 1, which is protein replacement, utrophin, dystrophin, as well as biopsy. Biomarkers 2 are everything else, to include MRI and serum and urine. We have trial outcomes measures and clinical trial design, and we have imperatives. And this is the group of parents that really comprises most of the foundations in our space to look at what is it that they want. And so we hope to submit draft guidance by the end of May, which will culminate in a meeting with the FDA because they're opening a docket for the guidance. They're going to review it, and then we'll come together on the FDA campus to discuss the guidance, and we're hopeful that they'll issue guidance for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. We as an advocacy organization feel that that's a good step. We hope it reflects and supports, and we have industry on board with the working groups so that it reflects what the community needs, wants, and how the FDA should respond to the needs of this community. And we're hoping it'll set a precedence for rare disease in developing draft guidance over time, and also encourage the FDA to be a little more flexible, or maybe a great deal more flexible in their review, and really focus on the patient voice as we try to get these therapies to the people who need and deserve them. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat, for a great presentation. This is such a relevant topic that we're a bit over time, but I would like to open for one question from the audience, if we have anyone. Yeah?
Sure.
I just wanted to know if you know of any other rare disease groups that are doing these risk versus benefit studies right now, and if it would help if you did have more.
So I do, and I wish Holly was here to tell you, because once the risk-benefit paper came out and we've made some presentations, the FDA has contacted us, and I know Holly's been working with Dr. Mashishki and talking to other rare disease organizations. In addition, our international partners in Italy are adopting the survey and translating the survey, and so we've had interest from Italy and the Netherlands as well as England, so or the UK, I should say. So we have a great deal of interest from certainly the Duchenne community around the world that's adopting it, and other communities who are using it. We're also working with Faster Cures because they would like us to help in the rare disease space. So we feel like it's been a good pilot, and as an advocacy organization, when we develop models and processes, we like to share them widely. First of all, it tells us we're doing a good job, so that's always helpful, right? And the second thing is we don't want to reinvent the wheel on a continuous basis because it just takes time, and it's time none of these patients have.
Thank you very much, Pat.
Thank you.